Hello, I'm here to give a little background on the context of the Saxon Heliand. The Heliand is an adaptation of the Gospel made to fit into the context of 9th century Saxony. It is more than just a translation of the Gospel, rather, it is a complete reimagining of it to fit a 9th century Saxon setting. Imagine, if you will, what it would be like if Jesus didn't live in Judea at the beginning of the Common Era, but instead, what if he was born in 9th century Saxony and lived in the culture that existed there at that time? The Heliand is an attempt to envision that scenario and use that new retelling of the Gospel to bring its message to the people of that time and place. To understand why someone would do that, I think it's important to understand what was going on at the time and how the Saxons first encountered Christianity. Prior to the Saxons' experience of Christianity, they worshipped the gods from the Norse pantheon, such as Woden and Thor. In many cases, a village would have a sacred tree or pillar, often meant to represent Yggdrasil, the cosmic tree of life. When they did encounter Christians, it was usually with hostility. At the time, there were two primary methods missionaries would use to convert pagan cultures. The Celtic tradition involved relating the gospel to the cultural context of the people. Then the non-accommodation method involved forceful conversions through military conquest, outlawing local religions, and baptism under the threat of death. The Saxons and other Germanic peoples would have become familiar with the non-accommodation method in 719 when St. Boniface marched into Geismar with Charles Martel's Frankish soldiers and chopped down the sacred oak of Thor in front of an angry mob of pagans. Boniface continued his campaign of forced conversion till his death at the hands of the Frisians in 754. Frankish King Charlemagne, estimated to have been born around 15 years after the death of St. Boniface, was a strong believer in Boniface's method of forced conversions. Through much of his reign, he waged a war to expand his empire and conquer the Saxons. With each area he conquered, he mandated that the population be converted to Christianity. He also seemed to have a philosophy that the Germanic peoples must be Romanized to fit the faith, rather than let the faith be Germanized. He even took this as far as requiring the Mass be conducted in a pure form of Latin, which none of the people of the area could even understand. Though Charlemagne repeatedly invaded Saxony and destroyed many of their major settlements, a lack of a central capital allowed the Saxons to always continue the fight with guerrilla-style tactics. Each time Saxony was pacified, they would later rise up to drive the Franks out. Their largest effort came in 782 under the leadership of Widukind, who refused to convert to Christianity when Charlemagne attempted to make Saxony a Frankish province. Widukind was elected leader of the Saxons through their annual General Assembly of the People, a much more democratic process than the Frankish monarchy. Over the course of 33 years of war, Charlemagne did manage to defeat the Saxon leader Widukind and convert him and all of Saxony to Christianity as a condition of their surrender. Following Boniface's example at Geismar, he then marched his forces into Saxony and destroyed their sacred pillar Irmunzel. The pillar was probably a representation of Yggdrasil and used for the worship of Woden and Thor. Given this turbulent introduction to Christianity, it is easy to see how many Saxons may not have embraced the new faith, even if the law required they pay lip service to it by being baptized and attending Mass. It is from this context that the Heliand was written to make the story of the Gospel more relatable to the Germanic peoples. While no one knows who wrote it or exactly when, many scholars theorize it was written by a monk from a monastery in either Corvey or Verden or Fulda, as seen here. There is some evidence to suggest that the Heliand may have been commissioned by Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son. A later work makes reference to a now-lost preface that was said to mention his commissioning the work, quote, so that not just the literate, but also the illiterate might have the sacred reading of the divine teachings opened up to them, end quote. If this evidence is true, then it would suggest that the Heliand was written around 830 CE, since Louis died in 840. It also suggests that continued turbulence from the Saxons may have led to a change in the philosophy of non-accommodation and the emphasis on only using pure Latin to communicate the gospel. The Heliand itself is written as an epic poem divided into 71 separate songs. It is not believed that it was meant for use in worship, rather it seems to have been written to be sung in mead halls or other social gathering places. Through this context, the story of the Gospels could become familiar to all the people, and it would be more relatable to them as well. Of course, changing the Gospel to fit a new cultural context does run the risk of changing the message. I think you'll see through our examination of themes that there are many pros and cons to this form of adaptation. As we explore the themes, it is important to note the Heliand was a compilation of the four Gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, translated by a 9th century Christian tasked with educating the conquered Saxon people about Christianity. At the beginning of the Heliand, the author explicitly states that these four Gospel writers are heroes from which the Christian message has been passed down. The Saxon people valued such concepts as loyalty, bravery, and leadership. They respected the authority of their Germanic leaders. The author of the Heliand is clearly trying to set off this Christian story by placing the forebears of the story in a position worthy of respect by calling them heroes. Most modern-day readers of the Heliand will clearly recognize the story of the New Testament within its pages. However, the significance and reasoning behind some of the language used by the author would not make sense without some further explanation. One of the first major differences between the Heliand and the New Testament as we know it is the setting. The New Testament was set in the area of the Mediterranean. Desert-like landscapes were a foreign concept to the Saxon people, so the Heliand author changed the setting to the lush forests that the Saxon people could identify with. This is most obviously noted during the wandering and temptation of Jesus Christ in the desert. In the Heliand, Christ emerges from the forest rather than the desert after his 40 days of wandering in the wilderness. The author also kept the names of cities and towns intact, but added the Saxon traditional suffix of burg, roughly translated to hillfort. In the English translation by G. Ronald Murphy, he translates it further to Galileeland, or the hillforts Rome or Nazareth. Hillforts were the traditional dwellings of the Saxon people, ruled over by earls or chieftains. Another difference the modern-day reader of the Heliand will notice is the language used for God, Jesus, and his followers. The Saxons were pagans worshipping the mortal gods Thor and Woden. There were more powerful immortal gods that they believed in as well, such as the wolf, serpent, and Hel, all the offspring of the god of mischief Loki. One of the tasks the author of the Heliand sets out to do is merging some of the pagan beliefs of the Saxons with the story of the Christian God and Jesus, all the while stressing the superiority of the Christian God over the pagan gods. Some of the terms used for God are Lord, Holy Chieftain, Master, and All-Ruler. The name All-Ruler gets at the heart of the superiority of the Christian God over the pagan gods. The term Holy Chieftain is also used for Jesus Christ himself, and relates to God and Jesus to the rulers of those hill forts, putting them in a position of power and respectability to valued Saxon attributes. Some of the other terms used for Jesus, and there were quite a few, were God's Son, Best of Men, the Rescuer, Almighty, Commander, God's Child of Peace, Protector of the Land, Guardian, and the Lord's Herdsman. That last name used for Jesus refers to the shepherding aspect of Jesus. The Saxons did not have herds that they shepherded, but had corralled animals watched over by a herdsman, which was not a very respectable position in Saxon culture. The Lord's Herdsman name for Jesus was used only once or twice throughout the Heliand. Some of the names used for Jesus' disciples were warrior companions, thanes, word-wise warriors, and the elite among the people. In Saxon culture, the chieftains would surround themselves with trusted people called warrior companions, who, if occasion called for it, would fight in the name of the chieftain. Here again the Saxon virtue of loyalty is played out. Another important group of people in this story are the Jews. The Jews were seen in a very negative light throughout the Heliand. They were usually lumped together as one group, instead of confusing the Saxon audience with an explanation of the different sects of Judaism in Jesus' time. The Jewish people were often described throughout the Heliand as slippery, murky, deceitful, sneaky, grim-hearted, and scheming. Their ultimate goal was to plot Jesus' demise. Jesus was never referred to by his Jewish heritage in the Heliand, except at his death, accused of claiming himself as King of the Jews. Magic is another concept seen throughout the Heliand. Without modern-day knowledge of science and illness, Saxons relied on magic, spells, and fortune-telling to explain or defend themselves from unseen evil forces. These evil little creatures are referred to in the Heliand's Lord's Prayer, which in and of itself is referred to as the Lord's secret spell. These spells were seen as a direct and immediate way to allow access to the power or God of the other world. Jesus is also seen as soothsaying or fortune-telling when he is teaching his disciples, what we know now as the 8 Beatitudes. A final theme found throughout the Heliand is that of light. There are many instances of people being described as radiant, shining, and brilliant. As an example, the Heliand begins by telling of the birth of John the Baptist, describing how his cheeks shone when he was born. The Heliand ends by describing Christ at his ascension to heaven, a place of great light and green meadows. Human life on Earth is also described as this light, or this world. At the time of death, a person moves to the other light. This other light could be referring to either heaven or hell. In the Heliand, the author merges the Saxon view of hell as the monster god, dark and murky, with the Christian concept of hell as hot and fiery. The concept of light is seen all the way through the Heliand as something good and to be desired. Let us now examine an excerpt directly from the Heliand. Here we have the Lord's Prayer said in the Old Saxon language, and as you'll note with the English translation written alongside it, it is not exactly a word-for-word translation of the Lord's Prayer as we know it.
Father usa firichobarno, thubis anthem hochon himmelarikia, gewichit si thinamo, werdo gewillico, kumathin kraftach riki, wertha thin willio of arthesa world Allah, so saman ertho, so thar upa ist, anthem hochon himmelarikia. Gefos dago gewilkas rad, drochten thegodo, thina helga helpa, en dialatus heavenas ward, mana goromen skuldio, also we othram manum doan, nelatus faledian letha wichti, so forth an iro willion, so we wirthia sind, ac helpus with our alun ubilun dadion. Amen.
The English translation of that prayer, read in the form of a spell, goes, Father of us, the sons of men, you are the high heavenly kingdom. Blessed be your name in every word. May your mighty kingdom come. May your will be done over all this world, just the same on earth as it is up there in the high heavenly kingdom. Give us support each day, good chieftain, your holy help, and pardon us, protector of heaven, our many crimes, just as we do to other human beings. Do not let evil little creatures lead us off to do their will as we deserve, but help us against all evil deeds. As you can see, the adaptation form of missionary evangelism does not simply translate the gospel into the local language, but actually changes it to fit into the local context. This practice of adaptive evangelism has been practiced throughout the history of the Church, and can be found in other examples of the gospel found among other cultures. To illustrate this point, let us look at the Native American culture. Here we see an example of the Choctaw adaptation of the Lord's Prayer.
Holy Himakni pa yomahi. Himakni tak ishpipita. Ahika pika shofi. Ahika kilika shofi. Anok polika ishpila welina. Nanok polo pita kofichi. Chima palichika ishtayali. Holy Toba Yakoke, thank you.
There we had the Lord's Prayer retold through the Choctaw language, as well as with their traditional sign language. For a more contemporary example, let us examine the Lord's Prayer as found in the Message Remix, where it is not simply translated into English, but the wording has been changed as well to be more relatable to a modern American society. Our Father in heaven, reveal who you are. Set the world right, do what's best, as above, so below. Keep us alive with 3 square meals. Keep us forgiven with you and forgiving others. Keep us safe from ourselves and the devil. You're in charge. You can do anything you want. You're ablaze in beauty. Yes, yes, yes. Finally, let's examine a modern gender-neutral version of the prayer, made to adapt to a more politically sensitive context, and thus make the message of the gospel more accessible to modern sensibilities. Our parent, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingship come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom of flowers, dressed better than Solomon, forever and ever, a miracle. As we can see from the different versions of the Lord's Prayer, the tradition of adapting the gospel to a different cultural context has persisted from ancient times all the way to the modern day. From the old Saxon in the 9th century, to the Choctaw of North America, to the Message Remix of the early 1990s, to the gender neutral of the 21st century. Cultures have reinterpreted the gospel in ways that best relate to their time and place. While there is always an effort to try to keep the general message the same, each culture brings its own unique interpretation as they readapt that message to fit their unique perspectives. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the Heliand. We hope it'll inspire you to explore this adaptation of the gospel, as well as to consider how the gospel may have been adapted for your time and place.